It's Sonia here of The Pretty Stitch with today's episode of Yarn Matters. So have you ever thought about learning how to knit? Well, I have some tips and suggestions for you that might help you in your knitting journey. Let's talk about it. So in my previous episode, I gave you some tips about learning how to crochet, how to get started, and I'm going to do the same with knitting. Now, confession time, I consider myself a much better crocheter than knitter, but I do like to knit too. And I do love to promote both crafts, and I do hope that these tips are helpful to you. And again, they're just tips, suggestions, not hard and fast rules. So tip number one that I have for you is just like tip number one for if you were going to begin crocheting, is don't break the bank. So what I mean by don't breaking the bank is don't spend a lot of money when you're just starting out. And the reason for that is if you've never knitted before, you think you're going to love it. I hope that you love it, but you might decide, you know what? I don't love it. It's not for me. And if you go out and you spend a lot of money on supplies, because knitting can get expensive. I know knitters love to say that crocheting is more expensive, but frankly, since I've done both crafts, and this is not a knitting versus crochet, that knitting's better than crochet, we'll get into that a little bit later. But knitting tends to require more tools to do certain projects. So if you need more tools, you need to spend more money. So I do feel like knitting can get a little pricey, especially with tools and things like that. So if you're just starting out, don't go out and buy all the fancy knitting kits and all this stuff. Start out small, start out basic, and then if you do fall in love with knitting, which I certainly, again, hope that you do, go out, spend all the money that you want on supplies. So tip number two is you need to get those supplies. So as I said, don't break the bank. So that goes with this, getting your supplies goes with tip number one. So what supplies do you need? Well, you will need some knitting needles. So knitting needles, if you're not sure what they look like, they can look like this. There's all different types of knitting needles. This is just a basic straight needle. We also have, these are a circular needle. There's also interchangeable needles. There's plastic needles. There's metal needles. There's bamboo needles. There's probably needles made out of oak. I mean, there's so many different needles. But I suggest just getting a pair of straight basic needle. And needles come in different sizes. So a size needle that I recommend, actually I recommend 3 sizes, and just get one of those sizes. So the first size that I recommend is a size 7. So here it is an example of a 7. Now this is a straight long needle. It's also a metal needle. I don't necessarily recommend, again, if you're just starting out, if you can find a cheap pair that is shorter than this. I find that it's easier when you're learning how to knit to have shorter needles. So this is a long one, but if you go to a thrift store, like I said, don't break the bank. You can find your supplies pretty cheaply at thrift stores, craft stores. I actually really recommend the thrift stores looking for crafting supplies, especially knitting needles. You can usually find like a whole can of them, and they're like 99 cents a pair. So look through that can or tray or whatever, wherever they have those craft sections, look for some inexpensive needles. These are like the classic, when people think about knitting, their grandma knitting, these types of needles. But the sizes are usually on the end, so the size is labeled right on the back here, or it could be on the package. But I just recommend a shorter set of needles. So this is a size 7, so a size I recommend. Another good size would be an 8. So here is a great example for a beginner. This needle is a little bit shorter, and these are size 8s. It's just easier when you're working with your stitches, because when you're learning, it's going to feel like literally you're all thumbs. You don't know what you're doing, things are falling, whatever. You're trying to like figure out, because you use 2 sticks with needles. So where is my other one? So here we go. You've got 2 of them, and it can get awkward trying to figure out what to do. So if you have really, really long needles, like you might smack yourself in the eye or who knows, so it's easier to manipulate and figure things out when you have shorter needles to start off with. I'm not trying to diss longer needles. Longer needles have their place, especially if you're making a blanket or whatever, or even circular ones. So here is my example of circular needles. Circular needles are really great. They're really handy for working a lot of projects, but this can get awkward when you've got this long cord, and it could get all like, who knows, yarn gets tangled up when you're learning. You don't know which way is up sometimes. So if you do have a pair of circular needles, they do make ones that are shorter, so there's less of this plastic. So for starting out, I do recommend that not having the super long cord with your circular needles if you want to go circular needle route. Again, just buy one size. So there's one more size, which I don't think I can't find it. I don't have it. I don't have as many knitting supplies as I do crochet supplies. Is a size 9 needle. So I recommend either 7, 8, or 9 to get started with. Just buy one of those sizes, not all 3, just one. And then start learning your basic stitches and go from there. And if you decide, hey, I love knitting, I want to knit all the things, then go out and buy more tools, play around with different types of needles. Some people really don't like metal needles because stitches can get a little slippery. They can slide off. So if that's really a problem for you, then you might want to switch to like a bamboo needle, a wooden needle, where the stitches, stick on there a little bit more. Some people don't like wooden needles for that reason, because they're like, the yarn's sticking on there, that's annoying me. So, as I said, there's different types of needles. Go out and explore once you've got your basic stitches down, once you've committed to knitting. If you haven't committed to knitting, don't go out and spend a lot of money, because again, it can get expensive. Tools can really add up quickly, and I'm on a budget, so that's important to me. I love crafting, I love crocheting, I love knitting, but I also love saving my money too. So being thrifty with that kind of thing, and just like buying the tools that I know I'm going to use, is really important to me. And I just wanted to share that with you. Another needle that might be helpful for learning, there's also double pointed needles. So here we go. Here are double pointed needles. So you can see they're much, much shorter. And as you can see, they have a point here and a point there. So if you're just starting out, I have taught a couple people how to knit just the basic stitches. Like I said, I'm not a super fancy skilled knitter, but I can teach somebody basic knit stitch, basic purl stitch. And I have found using these shorter needles have been a little bit easier for some of my students, because we can just put a couple stitches on there, and it's a lot easier to work with just a couple stitches and shorter needles than something super long. So that's another thing to keep in mind is, there's the double pointed needles too. And I actually got these at the thrift store for 99 cents. And usually double pointed needles come in a pack of 4, so I have 2 more of these as well. But when you're just starting to knit, you're only going to use 2 needles, because you can use a whole bunch more needles, and that's you're knitting in a circle, and you could use double points for that. But when you're just getting started, you're going to work in a row, you're going to use 2 needles. So enough about needles. Hopefully I haven't confused you. But the next thing that you're going to need, so supply number 2, is you will need yarn to go with your needles. So as I said before, don't break the bank. Don't break the bank with yarn. Get inexpensive yarn. Get yarn that is light in color, like we have here. We have this lovely shade of blue, also suggests a solid color yarn. When you're learning how to knit, you want to be able to see what you're doing. if you have a multicolored yarn, it's going to be difficult to see what your stitches look like. Not to diss multicolored yarn, I love multicolored yarn, but I have found when I am teaching people how to knit or crochet, using a solid light colored yarn is the way to go. It's just a lot easier for people to learn and see what they're doing on. And this yarn is a number 4 yarn here, and it's a worsted weight yarn. So this yarn would pair well with the size needles that I recommended for starting out. There's also other types of yarn that's a lot thinner than this. So if you find yarn that's slightly thinner, you could also use, here's another light solid colored yarn. I'm not sure if it's going to show, but you could also use number 3. So again, solid color, light. This is a lovely shade of gray, light blue. So this one's a number 4, this one's a number 3. I wouldn't really get into any other yarns except for these 2 sizes when starting out. You don't need to buy both of them. Buy one, or again, thrift stores. Thrift stores often will just have like a bag of random yarns, and this is in our country. I'm in the US, so this number 4 yarn is sold everywhere. Or if you're in Europe, from what I've heard, I have some international friends, they tell me that DK weight yarn, so this is DK weight, this is number 3, is more readily available in their country. So, and I'm sure they have, secondhand stores in overseas. So look in your secondhand store, see if you have a whole bunch. You can find some random number 3 yarn in a solid color. Highly recommend one of these sizes. Again, if you're going to buy it new, just buy one skein. Don't buy 6, 7, just buy one and start practicing with that one. And then if you decide, hey, I love knitting, this is the best thing ever, go out and buy all the beautiful yarn. There's so much beautiful yarn out there. Now, I don't recommend going back to needles, getting super teeny tiny needles. Like here we go. These are size 3s. You can tell they're very, very tiny, very, very thin. Nothing wrong with these needles in and of themselves, but if you're just starting out, these are going to create teeny tiny stitches, and it's going to be really hard just learning with teeny tiny stitches. So you might have some knitting needles that you inherited from a family member or just laying around your house, and you might have teeny tiny ones. You can try to learn on these, but really don't recommend the teeny tiny knitting needles. And the same goes with teeny tiny yarn. So here we have quite some fine yarn, which would result in more of a lace type thing. If you're just starting out, don't buy lace yarn. Just don't. No. I love crocheting with lace. I love crocheting with lace yarn in particular. I don't do a whole lot of knitted lace because I knit like a snail. I'm really slow. I can do it, but I'm slow. So for me to knit lace would take me the rest of my life probably, but I can crochet lace pretty quickly. But maybe I will try to knit some lace. I don't know. But I just don't recommend, something really fine like this just starting out, because it's going to take you forever. You're going to get discouraged and you're probably going to quit. So that will tie in with tip number 3, but we're still on tip number 2 of getting our supplies. So the third thing that you will need in your knitting journey, a yarn needle. So here we go. It just looks like a larger sewing needle, but it's a yarn needle, and you will want one of these because if you're making a project, you're going to have tails, you're going to have ends of yarn, and you don't want them showing. So your yarn needle will help to hide those tails. So you're going to need to be able to thread that yarn through that hole so that you can hide the tail within your project. Now there's different types of yarn needles. This is a metal yarn needle. These are my preferred yarn needles, but there are also plastic ones, and these needles can also be called tapestry needles, which I did not mention in my crochet video. They're very inexpensive. Sometimes they come in a pack of 2 or 3. You can find these on Amazon. You can find them at a one of the big box craft stores like Michael's. You could probably find them at Walmart. I mean, very inexpensive. Maybe you could find them at a thrift store. I actually never found yarn needles at thrift stores, but again, these only cost a couple bucks. And then your last item that you'll need for your knitting journey is scissors. You'll just need a pair of scissors, but anything that cuts. So if you do not have scissors, you could use nail clippers, you could use cuticle scissors. You know, I have used those items because my scissors, as I said, have grown legs and have run away. So I've had to cut my yarn and I'm like, I can't find any scissors. So nail clippers, cuticle cutters, they do the job. I think I've used a kitchen knife before when I was really super desperate. But those are the only items that you need to begin your knitting journey as far as supplies. So you'll need your needles, so shorter, straight needles in either sizes 7, 8, or 9, and just get one pair of knitting needles. You'll need your yarn in size 3 or 4 in a solid light color. Again, just get one unless you can find a cheap bag of random scraps of yarn at a thrift store, because yarn can get super expensive. So just get one to start off with, and then you'll need your yarn needle and scissors. So tip number 3 I have for you in your knitting journey is set yourself up for success. Just like I said with my crocheters, is when you're learning how to knit, you want to learn the basics. You want to start out small. So as I said in crocheting, you want to learn to crawl before you walk. You want to learn to walk before you run. So don't try to make that knit lace project right away. Don't try to knit a sweater. I know I've only made like 3 sweaters, knitted sweaters, and they took me forever. And 2 of them were baby sweaters. As I said, knitting is, I like knitting, but it doesn't come as easily to me as crocheting. So start off with the smaller projects. Learn your basics. So learn your basic stitches and get a good foundation so that you can set yourself up for success, so that you can make that amazing sweater, make that beautiful lace shawl. If you don't bother to do those things, you're going to get frustrated and you're just going to want to quit. And also, it's okay if, let's say, you just love to knit one stitch. My grandmother loved to knit. She taught me how to knit. She only taught me one stitch. I think she could do knit and purl, but she only preferred to do the knit stitch. And she made everything that she would give to us grandkids in the knit stitch. And that was fine. You know, that's what she enjoyed. She was a nurse and she loved to come home and she loved to just knit. Plain knitting, that was her way of relaxing. So if you love to knit but you don't want to learn a bunch of other stuff, that's okay too. But, you know, just learn those basic stitches so that you can, you know, really take off with your knitting journey. So my tip number 4 is there is no knitting police. So what do I mean by that? I love knitters, and I have been in this crochet knit world for quite a few years now. So I do have just a little bit of experience, just a tiny little bit. So I've been doing this for over 12 years. Like, I sell patterns, I write patterns, I've worked for publications, I have been to different local yarn stores. You know, I've been in the knitting circles, I've been in the crochet circles. And I have seen some things. I have noticed some things. I have observed some things. So knitters, I love knitters. I really, really do. But sometimes knitters can be like that older sister that you're always trying to please, but you never can. If you kind of get my drift, they can kind of be like that. They can be a tough crowd. So don't do that. There's no knitting police, especially with a beginner. You know, you're gonna maybe not knit the way, if you're an experienced knitter, you see a beginner and you'll be like, oh, you shouldn't do it like that. That might work for them. So as I said, there's no knitting police. Now, there are fundamentals, so you do need to learn your basic stitches, but how you hold your needles, how you hold your yarn, There's no right or wrong way. There's continental knitting, there's throwing, and I've heard continental knitters tell throwers, well, you should only do continental. And I've heard throwers say, well, you should only throw. I do a combination of both. I do continental knitting and I also throw, sometimes within the same project, because that's what works for me. So there is no knitting police. There's no crocheting police either, but I don't really find that as much in the crochet world. And I'm not trying to be mean or anything, but I really want to grow these crafts, and there's no knitting police. Just check it out the door. There's no yarn specifically for one craft or the other. I've heard that too. Well, you can only use this yarn for crochet. You could only use this yarn for knit. And usually what that means is you can't use this beautiful, lovely, my friend, cashmere silk yarn can only be used for knitting. You can't crochet with this. No, 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 no. Crocheting is not better than knitting. Knitting is not better than crochet. It's yarn. It can either be knit with or it can be crocheted with. And unfortunately, I have seen this attitude mostly with knitters. So if you're a beginner knitter and you've encountered that, I'm really sorry. Not everyone is like that. And I do feel like attitudes are changing. And sometimes just laugh it off. I've been to local yarn stores and they're asking me, well, what kind of yarn are you looking for? What are you knitting today? And I'll be like, oh, well, I'm going to crochet with this. And they're just like, you can't sit with us. And it's annoying, and I usually just laugh it off. I'm like, it's yarn. You can do either or. It's okay. One is not better than the other. They're different. Differences aren't usually not, a lot of times different is not bad, it's just different. And there are some things that I like better, that I think look better that are knitted, and I feel like there are some projects that I feel like look better that are crocheted. That's just a personal opinion, personal preference. So, no knit police. None of that. Check the attitude at the door, please. So those are all of my tips that I have for you. I hope that they were helpful, and remember, they're just tips, just suggestions, not hard and fast rules. So if you liked this video, please like and subscribe. If you didn't like this video, that's okay, no problem. Just scroll on by, and I will see you next time. Happy stitching. Bye!